Good morning. For the gentleman from EOG, quick question. Can you talk to us a little bit about changing the mindset of your land teams and moving from the old way of taking care of the land to this different approach?
Yeah, sure. That's a good point too. I think that was somewhat of a challenge in the beginning. Just in our industry, shifting that mindset and kind of shifting that culture of, like you say, the old way of doing business, and shifting that to more of a conservation-minded approach. And I think we've seen the benefit in even developing more trust with landowners by doing that.
Hey, question for Neal real quick. Appreciate all the data you shared with us, specifically for your graph with all the stick figures on there showing that less than 1% of the population are landowners. How do y'all define a landowner? Is that greater than 1 acre or 5+ acres for people that are considered landowners?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for these data, what we used was the combination of the ag census, so everybody that was in the ag census, and then those that get a 1D1 appraisal, which is an agricultural appraisal from the county appraiser's district. So that's, which really are the only objective things out there. Now, granted, there could be landowners out there that are farmers, ranchers, or forest landowners that aren't in those two groups, but it's still a pretty good gauge, particularly when you're looking at it, the change from one time to the next, whether you're losing, gaining, or whatever. Good question, though.
How about the divide between urban and rural?
The divide between urban and rural?
What's the definition of urban landowner versus a rural landowner?
So that, obviously that's location. And so there's designations that are, I believe they're designations that are urban versus rural designations that are zip code related, I think. I think that's right. But there are a set of decided upon designations that, rural means a certain density of population versus urban meaning a certain density. So and I can't remember the exact office that would do that designation, but it's by some geographic unit.
Hello. My question is for Kevin with the OG, and could be for Jim too, Giocomo. It sounds like y'all done certainly your homework and choosing the right seed and the right people and right partners to put this native grass and forbs in the ground. My question is, have you considered the use of cover crops, winter and spring cover crops, which we've had a lot more success after doing this for many years, and reestablishing by going to a system of cover crops prior to planting the native grasses and forbs?
Yeah, it's not, I don't know that it's something we've considered yet, and I may defer to Matt on that too. He's like the seed mix guy. So yeah, Matt may have something to add.
By nature. And Jim, we are planning to use cover crops where we've got existing vegetation that we need to control, and then to occupy that void before we plant the native. So in that situation, we use a cover crop. Most of the time, we're planting on new construction, so we have a bare soil that we can work with that's ready for the natives.
I just would like to comment on that, Matt, that we just find that cover crops just help to improve the till of the soil, and makes that ultimate planting of natives a lot more successful.
We've got a good candidate for that too.
Great.
This question is for Jim. I was wondering what types of groups can join the Oaks and Prairies joint venture, and what does joining entail?
So the partnership itself is open to any interested organization, individual who would like to work on our shared priorities of increasing the bird populations through habitat management of grasslands. So there's lots of different ways that could happen. Individual landowners are working with our technical biologists to do habitat on the ground. We also work at the regional level, doing training workshops and for landowners and for the biologists who are working with landowners. So there's those ways to help. Investing in the incentive program itself or the staff that assists with those parts are welcome. And then doing bird counts and helping with some of that work, we bring in volunteers a lot of times. So lots of different ways, and we're always open to suggestions. Thank you.
So I have a question, and this is to Jim on the oaks and prairies. You specifically talked about the ecoregions. You had listed the several ecoregions that y'all work with. I have a question. Do you work with the transition areas, the transition zones? Like, for instance, you have the Blackland Prairie and Edwards Plateau. You have a transition zone. Do you work with landowners within those transition zones, or is it specifically defined in the Edwards Plateau?
So we have specific focal counties that the programs are available, but if a landowner comes in and says they want to work on what can you do in their land, we'll help them find the technical guidance and the programs that would work in those counties. But the counties that I showed are the ones we selected so that we're not doing random acts of conservation kindness. If you mapped out what we've done so far, 85,000 acres over that 6 million acres, you wouldn't be able to see it on the screen really because it's tiny, but we're building. So we're trying to focus, but at the same time provide the resources that any landowner who would ask for, make that available to them. Does that help?
Yes, sir, thank you.
So Jim, another question for you, unfortunately. But so when I was looking at the land fragmentation problem, it's also an opportunity from a standpoint of land restoration, because you have these landowners who have moved out freshly, don't know much, want to improve their land, and they say, okay, yeah, I want to do land restoration. I'm seeing an opportunity to promote that. But then I look at like the PUB program, the Pastures for Upland Birds program, and you have to have 25 acres to get that kind of financial support. So I wonder if you guys are giving much thought to how to empower smaller acreage landowners to restore their land.
Right, so our Grassland Restoration Incentive Program does have a minimum acreage of 25 acres. We picked that specifically because that's the size of a northern bobwhite quail territory. That's the largest territory size of all our birds. If you look at the distribution of land ownership, 80% of the landowners own less than 25 acres. So it costs the same for a larger landowner and a smaller landowner to do a project. We chose to focus on the larger projects to get a bigger bang for the buck, but if someone with smaller acreage wants to do a project, we can direct them to partners who are working in those areas. A lot of the monarch conservation projects are 1 or 2 acres. That's great for monarchs, not necessarily great for building a sustainable population of birds. So it's part of doing these conservation projects is figuring out what we can do best and where we can focus and where we can kind of get that benefit of working against fragmentation by putting projects close to each other and making them similar. So 25 acres is our minimum, and we can point directly back to a bird population number, but it's also because of that distribution of land ownership. Only 20% of the landowners have more than 25 acres, and that's where 80% of the land is.
We'll go to yes, I have a question for Kevin. You had mentioned when you were doing reseeding projects that you didn't see a lot of invasive species. Are you managing those on the tract? Is that something that y'all are taking on right now?
It's something that we've addressed and we're mindful of. It's not something just yet on these reseeding sites that we've used any kind of treatment to prevent that. But it's something that we're seeing really across some of these seeding sites where it's going to be a problem, and it's just something we're going to have to figure out.
Thanks.
A really fascinating panel today. I have a question, either as Neal or Jim's slides, you showed the growth of the suburban areas around our urban cores and the sprawl that's happening. I'm curious what this panel's thoughts are regarding the growth of our urban areas and how that is reducing some of the habitat that we are seeing around our urban areas.
I moved to Texas from the eastern United States, and I'm amazed at how much land there is available to do conservation relative to what I saw when I lived in Pennsylvania and Tennessee. Especially for grasslands, there's a lot of opportunity, even in urban areas. So we've kind of talked about having urban areas is kind of a last-ditch effort to protect some of the lands that have never been plowed, and there still are some of those. You can find those on Google. You can identify MEMA mounds and stuff like that on Google in this area that are right next to city development. Those are the ones that you probably need to acquire and make into parks, which they've done in Houston recently with, I think it's called Deer Park. And then the kind of interface between the rural areas and the urban areas are the next step out. And then we're working in more of the further away from the urban populations in the rural areas. All three of those need to be addressed, and you just got to kind of pick and choose, and it's different strategies for different things. In our rural areas, we're paying on working lands for private landowners to continue doing the work they're doing, but also consider some of the options to provide wildlife habitat management, which wouldn't really work in an urban area. You either need to protect it or it's going to be developed into something. So there's different strategies in different areas.
Taylor, Taylor, I had a question for you around the great work you're doing with Ducks Unlimited. You said about half the costs are borne by the landowner. If you could read their mind, what would you say their motivation is? Is it improving the value of their land, or is it just altruism, or are they hunters, or what is their motivation?
I would say it's a combination of all of the above. A lot of these landowners are in it for example, half of them are rice producers, and so implementing these wetland projects in that landscape is beneficial for producing rice. You're flooding to the same depths that you would for waterfowl, and so inputting the infrastructure on that landscape is beneficial to their bottom line, as well as the opportunities that it provides them through hunting opportunities. Another cohort of landowners is just your regular landowner who has a cattle operation, and they could turn around and lease that property to a hunting club or to a group of folks who want to lease that. And so by investing a little bit of money or $150 an acre in creating these wetlands, they can recover that. We do ask that in these sites that they're not hunted more than 3 days a week, because we are trying to provide habitat for these birds to rest and be able to feed and build up their fat reserves before returning to Canada. But I would say between those two, those are some of the bottom lines for getting the landowners to invest so much into these projects.
I have a question for Taylor. Your 300-acre cost share, is that for the duration of the agreement, the 10 to 15 years? Is that on an annual basis, or is that a one-time deal? Or is it a one-time deal?
So that's an initial payment to cover a reimbursement of the cost to construct that project. And so, for example, if we were to build a 100-acre wetland on a landscape, our max reimbursement would be $30,000 towards that landowner, but they would have to have the invoices and encumber the cost to receive that reimbursement. And it's a one-time payment.
My question is also for Taylor and Jim, kind of along those same lines. What are some of the biggest challenges you face in providing those financial incentives?
You want to go first, or you want me?
Go ahead.
Okay.
You're on a roll.
So I would say getting funding in the door and then turning around and matching that with federal funding is probably the toughest aspect. North American Wetland Conservation Act is celebrating its 30 years of funding within the United States and Canada and Mexico. And so writing these grants are a very involved process, but that funding is available in up to $1 million. And by the time you match 2 to 1, so for every $2, you get $1 of federal funding. So finding those match partners and the other organizations to be able to put that money into a pot to turn in a grant is probably one of the more difficult aspects of getting the funding into the program. But then you have that funding for 3 years, and you are delivering these habitats on the landscape for the term of that agreement.
Yeah, and so for our program, we average about $40 an acre for grassland work, so it's a little less intensive than the wetland work. But our practices range from $20 an acre to $450 an acre, depending on whether we need to use mechanical removal or if we're just doing prescribed fire. But what Taylor just said is true, but at the same time, spending the time to build the trust to figure out what the landowner's objectives are, that costs money to also, have the time to be able to go and do those 8 visits to build trust enough that the landowner might be interested, and you might figure out what their motivations are, because every time you see a human dimension study of what are the motivations of humans, they're all over the place. Everyone has a different reason for doing what they want to do, but everyone kind of wants to do a good thing in the big picture. And so no matter how they get there, we'll try to help them out, based on their motivations. So that's one challenge.
My question's for Kevin. Kevin, you may have not been doing this long enough, but I'm interested to know your EOG's interest in reclaiming the land using natives. Do you see that as a kind of return on investment when you're acquiring leases and landowners more interested in working with EOG versus somebody else?
I think that's the goal, right, is to try to make it more economical. And it's something that we're looking at from the operations of the seeding, perhaps the seed mix, like adjusting the seed mix. That's really where the added cost is. But yeah, it's something that we want to make more economical for those dollars we put into the project.
Thank you guys for the questions, and thank you again to our panelists.